when I set out to write the book, I had no idea that, say, Donald Trump was going to get the nomination or even run. But there are some long-term trends that have been going on in our culture for a very long time. And I think that, as I like to say, Donald Trump isn't the cause of all of our problems, but he's a symptom of them. And those symptoms are larger than just what's going on the right or just what's going on the left. They are currents that are running around through basically all of the West, including in Europe. Populism and nationalism are at the forefront, and I think phenomena that are that big and that complex are going to have manifestations of themselves at almost any given moment, for years to come. What we're really experiencing in this country and across the West is a breakdown in the institutions that traditionally give us a sense of meaning and belonging in our lives. We typically call these things civil society, but it also includes things like the family. And look, what has two thumbs and loves capitalism? This guy. But capitalism can't... Capitalism depends on values it cannot create and cannot restore once lost. And those values are incubated in the family and in church and synagogue and in faith, and also in all the what Edmund Burke called the little platoons of civil society, these little institutions that give people a sense of meaning and belonging. And when they break down, what happens is we don't lose our desire for meaning and belonging. We look to other things to provide them. And among the things that historically have done that are things like tribalism or nationalism or populism or just simply politics. And more people are turning to politics for a sense of meaning and belonging and tribal identity, and it's profoundly unhealthy. One of the things I try to do in the book is work on the assumptions that modern, secular, progressive, people who aren't necessarily conservative consider to be the sort of central things: science, evolution, right? Economics, material metrics about well-being. And what we see is that capitalism has done unbelievably, truly miraculous things for improving man's material condition, for improving our public health, longevity. You can go down an incredibly long list that people like Steven Pinker have turned into a whole book. But what it can't do is fill the holes in your soul. It can't give you a sense of meaning or belonging. And so one of the things that we're seeing today, just look at the rise of partisanship. Social scientists are kind of overwhelmed by the fact that one's partisan identity is now a bigger driver of attitudes and behavior for millions of people than religion or ethnicity or even sex or gender or race are. And that's because our desire to sort of, as the normal institutions that provide those things wither, we attach ourselves to these partisan causes. And so you have an enormous rise in what they call negative partisanship. Negative partisanship is about how there are millions of people who the only reason they call themselves Democrats is because they hate Republicans. And the only reason why millions of people call themselves Republicans is because they hate Democrats. That's a very tribal way of viewing the world. In tribal societies, which is what we all evolved in, our brains are designed to see the people like us or the people that we form coalitions with as good, and everybody outside is the dangerous other. And that is defining so much of our politics these days, where you have people say that it's worth being a jerk so long as the right people are offended. People defending some of the things that Donald Trump says or tweets purely on the grounds that it's, that liberal tears are delicious, that kind of thing. And you see the same phenomenon on the left with people going after the right, mocking religion, mocking traditionalism, purely because it makes, Mike Pence sad. And this is a profoundly unhealthy way to think about politics. The miracle, the reason I chose the word miracle and not the Enlightenment, right, or even modernity, is that, first of all, it's miraculous. It is bizarre. For 250,000 years, or however long Homo sapiens existed since we split off from the Neanderthals, the average human being everywhere in the world lived on no more than $3 a day. Man's natural environment was grinding poverty, punctuated by an early death, either from violence or some bowel-stewing disease. And then once and only once in all of human history did human prosperity for the average person, not some aristocrat, not some pharaoh or emperor, start to go up. And it's been going up ever since. That's just 6 lifetimes that we've leapt out of our natural state, in a sense. Or even if you want to go back to the agricultural revolution, that was only 10,000 years ago. We existed for hundreds of thousands of years before that. And one of the reasons why I call it a miracle is that it's just simply miraculous, the transformation that we have. But also because we really don't understand why it happened. There are lots of good theories. I think most of the theories are actually pretty good about explaining parts of it, but there is no consensus. There's a total consensus about the poverty for 250,000 years. There's no consensus about why we got out of it. And so part of my understanding of what a miracle is it's some glorious, wonderful thing that happens that you can't explain. Now, as part of my argument, I don't attribute it to God. I have no problem with people who do. But what I'm trying to do is persuade people who come from that other side of the political aisle that even if you don't think God has anything to do with it, that we should still have a profound sense of gratitude for it. And for me, conservatism is best understood as a disposition of gratitude. You look around the world, you look around your society, and you see those things that are valuable, that are lovely, that you want to pass on to the next generation. Maybe improved, but certainly not degraded. And you only can do that if you have a sense of gratitude for them. And instead, in this country, we teach ingratitude. We teach ingratitude as a matter of higher education, of popular culture. We teach people that they're owed something. We teach people to be resentful. Resentment is the opposite of gratitude. And when you have that attitude, when you have that mindset that says, I'm owed more than what I have, and you take everything that we have for granted, you start acting as if there are people who took what you're owed away from you. And that is the driving sense of grievance that informs so much of populism, of nationalism, of identity politics, of tribalism, of socialism, which is not in the subtitle, but easily could have been, sort of implied. And I honestly think that the way out, I mean, there are some policy things that we can do, but first of all, we need to open our hearts to the fact that we're all lucky to be alive in this country, in this civilization at this time, because no one has had it better as a generalization. I think one of the reasons why the conservative movement got into the cul-de-sac that it did is that it lost sight of this basic understanding of what politics is supposed to be about. It's supposed to go back to Aristotle. It's supposed to be about persuasion, about convincing someone that their interests are better served by being a member of your coalition than somebody else's, than the coalition they're currently in. And instead, we emphasized purity, that we said that if anybody doesn't agree with us entirely, they're a squish or a rhino. Once you start emphasizing purity on the left or the right, you are necessarily pushing away people who might agree with you on a lot and might be members of your coalition. Reagan used to say, if you agree with me on 7 out of 10 things, you're my 70% friend, you're not my 30% enemy. And one of the things that Reagan did not talk about being a conservative very much. He didn't talk about being a Republican very much. He talked about what he believed were universal or at least fundamental American values and tried to attract people to his arguments by making arguments and primarily by telling stories. If you go back and you watch Reagan's speeches, he illustrated his points by just telling stories. Sometimes they were kind of hokey and old-fashioned. Sometimes they were just funny jokes. But, you know, our brains are wired to understand things through stories. You know, most of our information for most of our time on this planet was conveyed through stories. The Bible is many things, but at its most basic level, it's a bunch of stories. Every important lesson you have in your life has a story attached to it. And storytelling, I'm not saying lying, I'm not saying fiction, but telling a story, a compelling story that opens people up to where you're coming from and, more importantly, where you want to go, is a much better way of doing politics than reading off a list of principles. And if you say you disagree with any one of the lists, anything on my list of principles, that you're a bad person or you're a traitor or you're wrong, doesn't really work very well. And so much of the problem that we have in our culture today, I don't want to get into the weeds on romanticism, but it's performative. We shout what we believe. We try to insult others to prove how great we are or how pure we are or how we have the right enemies. One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, which my wife had blown up and framed for me, has two dogs at a bar, and one dog they're drinking like martinis, and one dog says to the other, you know, it's not good enough that dogs succeed. Cats must also fail. And that's the essence of sort of our tribal politics these days, where we care less about winning, save as measured by whether or not it's making the opposition lose or feel like losers. And that has no limiting principle to it, which is why our politics continually get uglier and uglier, because it's sort of like the junkie who just needs to keep upping the purity of the dose or the quantity of the dose. We need to constantly mainline more outrage about how terrible the other people are or how unfair they're being to us. What civilization is, sort of by definition, is a system that constrains human nature in positive ways. Right? In a natural environment, the way you get what you want is if you have a bushel of apples and I want your apples, I hit you over the head with a rock and I take your apples. So that's why one of the first things that any civilization worthy of the name civilization does is regulate violence. Because in human nature, we see anybody outside of our group as fair game. And what a civilization does is says, no, there has to be rules that everybody apply to everybody fairly, sort of the golden rule, do unto others. That is the way you regulate violence, that's the way you regulate behavior. As civilizations advance and mature and civilize, we set ever higher standards for our expectations of human conduct. This is one of the reasons why it drives me crazy when I hear parents tell their kids, just go with your instincts. You don't tell kids to go with their instincts. That's how they take your car keys and stick them into a light socket. The whole point of being a good parent is to teach kids not to go with their instincts. No hitting, right? Let go of your sister's hair. That is what we do when we civilize kids who just come with the factory preset programming of human nature. And institutions throughout human history have been doing this. We get the word nepotism from the Catholic Church. It means almost literally nephewism. And it comes out of the corrupt practice of archbishops and cardinals having affairs or having secret families and giving special jobs or special perks to their quote-unquote nephews. And nepotism is hardwired into us. There's never been a society anywhere in human history where people didn't give special preferences to their own offspring, never mind their family, their kin, their friends. Favoritism is natural. But we understand that a functioning society needs to hold that stuff at bay. The Chinese tried it and the Turks tried it by literally taking slaves and castrating them, thinking, okay, well now they'll have no loyalty except to the state or to the sultan or whoever it is. But it turned out over time that didn't even work, because the sort of the janissaries and the eunuch bureaucrats formed their own sort of coalition or tribe and conspired against the state. The only real way that you can hold human nature at bay is by civilizing people, by teaching people right from wrong. And when you don't do that, human nature comes rushing back in. That's the real source of corruption in life. That's the story of Lord of the Flies, right? Lord of the Flies, you got these little kids. They're the pinnacles of Western civilization. These little British schoolboy kids, boarding school kids. You drop them off on a deserted island with no adult supervision, and like 5 minutes later, they're running around with spears and war paint and worshipping some pagan god and trying to kill each other. That's one of the reasons why I love like zombie movies and a post-apocalyptic pop culture, because the second the thin veneer of civilization vanishes or suspends, people revert back to human nature, which is small nomadic bands of tribal people fighting in a zero-sum battle against other nomadic bands and zombies. And so when we see civil society break down, because that is where civilization happens, right? One of my favorite quotes comes from Hannah Arendt, where she says, every generation, Western civilization is invaded by barbarians. We call them children. And that's why Ronald Reagan said, we are never more than one generation away from tyranny, because we're not born with liberty in our blood. You have to fight for it in every generation and pass it on. But we live in a profoundly romantic period where we tell people that the highest source of moral authority isn't God, who you should be afraid of and is always watching you, but your own gut. your own instincts. Stay true to yourself. Live by your own code, and you're a good person. And when you teach people on a mass scale that they are the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, that they are their own priests, it becomes much more difficult to get people to have a sense of what is good for the greater good, or what is simply just right and wrong beyond a utilitarian calculus that says, if it's good for me, or if it feels good, I'm going to do it. And as a culture, that system has broken down. It's broken down because these institutions are no longer able to do their job, starting with the family. Out of wedlock birth is through the roof. And again, so what we do is instead is we retreat from real communities and we go in fake ones like Facebook, where we, I think Facebook is essentially a envy machine where we curate our lives, make it seem like we're having a better time than we really are. But the worst part of that is politically, is when we go on Facebook or when we retreat to Fox News or to MSNBC or whatever website that tells us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, we have all of our biases confirmed, all of our worst instincts confirmed and ratified, to the extent where we no longer can hear anybody who disagrees with us and not think they're insulting us or that they're the enemy. The original proposal had as the title Wealth, and the idea being that it was going to be a sort of a response to Thomas Piketty's book Capital. But it dawned on me pretty early on, I'm not an economist. And also I wanted to make a slightly different, a broader argument. And so then for a very long time, the working title, which I still like a lot, is The Tribe of Liberty. Because part of my argument was that mere reason isn't enough. Mere, economic efficiency isn't enough. As Chesterton likes to say, the purely rational soldier will not fight. The purely rational man will not marry. You need higher principles, ideas, value structures, permission structures to civilize people. And one of the things that we need is a tribal attachment to liberty. We don't get liberty from the Constitution. The Constitution is in many ways the end process of a bizarre cultural evolution that takes place on the ground in England, where a lot of the customs and habits of liberty emerge as organic artifacts of a lived experience. And what the Founding Fathers did, the glorious thing about what the Founding Fathers did, is they took these cultural norms, because they considered themselves for the longest time British citizens. That's why they were mad. And they felt that what they called their ancient rights and liberties were being violated. And so what they did is they sort of put these customs and norms in a centrifuge and purified them and made them into abstract principles and then wrote them down. And that was a great gift. But for whatever reason, the publisher had a problem with Tribe of Liberty. Salespeople couldn't understand it. They thought this was, and so we had this long negotiation. And one of the reasons why I didn't go with Death of the West or The End of the West or The Decline of the West is that I don't believe in the phrase, I think the phrase, the right side of history is garbage. It has a certain, as Richard Pipes likes to say, it has a certain Marxist twang to it. Nothing is inevitable. That's the point of when Reagan said, we're never more than one generation from tyranny. It requires effort. Civilization requires effort. And I'm not trying to belittle anybody with mental health issues, but suicide is a choice. We are making a choice to go down a certain path. And we can make a choice to get out of it. One of my intellectual, main influences for this book was an economic historian, Deirdre McCloskey, who argues that the miracle emerges basically because of words. The story that we tell ourselves about ourselves radically changed for the first time in the late 1600s in profound ways. I call it the Lockean Revolution, this idea that our rights come from God, not from government. We are citizens, not subjects. The fruits of our labors belong to us. Innovation is a good thing, which for most of human history was seen as very suspect because it challenged the powers that be in the status quo. And that emerged through words and ideas and rhetoric. And I don't think Deirdre has fully explained where the miracle comes from, but I think she's explained an indispensable part of it. And it is true, though, that if you take it as true that you can talk yourselves into the miracle, you can talk yourselves out of it. And that is what I think is happening in higher education, in popular culture, and in our politics, is that we are making arguments that are throwing the Constitution, the principles that it represents, the cultural inheritance that we have, we're throwing it all away in this spat of tribalism and nationalism and identity politics, all of which run counter to this glorious idea that the individual is sovereign, that we are captains of ourselves, and that the market is not just good, it is the only anti-poverty program that has ever worked in all of human history, and we're taking it all for granted. And that's ingratitude, and that is a suicidal choice. Charles Krauthammer, my late friend, he gave a wonderful speech a few years ago titled "Decline is a Choice." Whether it's the entitlement crisis or a host of other things, we know, or at least enough people of good faith know what we have to do. It's just too damn hard. I mean, I don't mean to sound like Al Pacino in Scent of the Woman about knowing the right path and not taking it because it's too damn hard. But the thing is, if we don't choose to go to correct, things will just get worse. And we're going to have to answer to our kids or our grandkids why we let things go down the sewer the way we have. And again, I'm ultimately an optimist. Edmund Burke says, "Example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other." And what it means by that is sometimes you have to show people. You can't just tell people. Ed Koch, who was mayor of New York City for 2 terms, and when he lost his 3rd bid, he was asked if he was ever going to run again, and he said, "No, the people of New York fired me, and now they must be punished." And we're going to learn some lessons from the Obama years and from the Trump years, and we have a choice to act on those lessons or to compound the problems that led us that way. One of the great things about liberal democratic capitalism is its capacity for self-correction. And I still think we have that. I also think that the arguments that we're seeing on these carnival stall shout shows of cable news and on talk radio and on the internet actually doesn't reflect the majority of the American people. When you go out in the real world, in the real country, and you talk to real people, people have sometimes profound differences with other people, but this is a deeply, deeply decent country with a wellspring of good intentions and moral seriousness. And what we lack is the ability to marshal political passion around those attributes. But I think just as this country produced a Lincoln when it needed it, we may be able to produce the kind of leadership that is required because we really have no other choice.